Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corin, so I'm beginning to listen to the episode about UTC GMT, the TZDB, and all the complications that are involved under the hood in the very amazing but complicated business of keeping time. And that's really at the digital level, but that has such a big imprint upon our lives, given that we just take for granted. I'm looking at my phone now. I won't tell you what time it is because you'll say, Daniel, go to sleep. It's not too bad, but it is the early hours of the morning, the small hours of the night. Good time for thinking. And this is, when you look at an Android device, thanks to this, this crazy TZDB system that resolves all these challenges related to time and the whole global network of atomic time and NTP servers, that's taken away all of the complications of your time clock, the time on your phone updates automatically. It's all beautifully synced and seamless. So because it's so seamless, it begins to take on the feel that, well, this is always the way it's been. Much like borders. I talked about borders in our previous episode, geopolitical borders, and that the way we think of them now, there's a very well-defined border. You can go on Google Maps, and it's this precise line over a precise course, and you think, well, that's always been the way the world has worked. And Corin, at the beginning of this episode about GMT versus UTC, said very eloquently that time is the ultimate social construct, and indeed it is. So today I'd like to talk about the evolution of timekeeping, and what particularly interested me when I did a bit of research for this follow-up episode was a simple question. The 24-hour clock, we haven't always lived in a world where it was possible to calculate time to the infinitesimally small degrees we do now with milliseconds, but the 24-hour clock of 24 hours, 60 minutes, 60 seconds, that's kind of the prototypical modern clock. That's how time works, according to our understanding. And it turns out that was not always the case, and indeed we can actually trace the beginning of this era of timekeeping back to a certain point in history. But I will leave that to Herman and Corin for the episode. My question is, before timekeeping was such a precise art, and we had Zoom meetings starting at 10 in the morning, and we knew that it was 9:57 and 32 seconds and 500 milliseconds when we were just trying to check our calendars to see who the meeting was with. Before we had this incredibly exact and sometimes oppressive system of timekeeping that people who are dubiously good at timekeeping like me have a mixed relationship with, what was it like? And when I read about the history of time, I was particularly interested to delve into the system of timekeeping in biblical times and in ancient Israel, given that that's sort of a subject of great interest to me. And it mentioned that the 24-hour, or the division of a day into 24 hours was, interestingly, part of already a thing at that time, but that the day and night were divided into 12 equal hours, which meant that the length of one of those subdivided hours constantly fluctuated. And that, interestingly enough, I can't consider myself a great scholar of the Talmud, but from the little bit that I know or can remember, I remember reading a section of a tractate talking about the mishmarot, the shifts at night, and that was actually a system of timekeeping in the ancient world, that they divided the nights into shifts. I thought it was always just a colloquial a colloquial reference. So I think, especially when we're trying to read text from ancient civilizations, this kind of knowledge is invaluable, because we need to park our understanding of the day as a 24-hour thing and clocks at the door. It just wasn't like that at all. So Herman and Corin, I'd love to know about how us humans have evolved over time. Sorry for the pun. To calculate time, and of course, the question that many must be wondering is, what was it like when we didn't have this precise system of time? Like, if you wanted to meet someone in ancient Rome, you weren't going to send them a Google Calendar invite to show up at the Colosseum at 10 a.m. But if there wasn't that precise system of timing, like, how did it work? Was it kind of like today, where you have informal systems like Israeli time, or people might say Daniel time? Daniel time is a very variable concept. When I say I'll meet you in an hour, sometimes it means precisely 60 minutes, and sometimes it means when I'm finished what I'm doing, and maybe 3 hours in our very modern system actually transpired. What was it like when we lived in a world where we simply didn't have the means to be so precise about how we specify times? How did you show up to work? I mean, there's just so many questions. Like, if you showed up to your ancient building site in ancient Israel, like, did your day start? Did the foreman say the sun is a bit too high? You're late to work. You're late to the morning bricklaying meeting because the sun, if you look over, it's moved over that tree. How did it work, Herman and Corn? This one is now over to you.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my weird prompts. I am Corn, and I am sitting here in our living room in Jerusalem. It is a surprisingly chilly February afternoon in 2026, and the light is just starting to hit that golden late winter angle across the stone walls of the old city. I am here, as always, with my brother.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I am ready to dive into some chronological chaos. It is actually quite fitting that we are recording this today, Corn. If we were living by the ancient standards we are about to discuss, our afternoon would be measured very differently depending on exactly which week of February we were in.
It is funny you say that, because today's prompt from Daniel is about exactly that. He has been listening to our previous discussions about time being a social construct, specifically that episode where we compared time zones to geopolitical borders, and he wants us to go deeper into the history. Specifically, he asked, before we had our current precise systems, how did people calculate and specify time to coordinate events, meetings, and work? How did ancient civilizations, particularly folks right here in the Levant during biblical times, actually coordinate their lives before we had atomic clocks and smartphones?
It is a fantastic question, Daniel. We really do take it for granted that a second is a second, whether it is noon in the middle of July or midnight in late December. We live in the era of mean time, where we have averaged everything out into a rigid mechanical grid. But for the vast majority of human history, that was not the case at all. Time was not a cage we lived inside. It was much more like a living, breathing thing that stretched and contracted with the seasons. It was organic.
Right. And that is what Daniel was mentioning in his prompt. He brought up this idea of the day being divided into 12 equal hours, but those hours were not 60 minutes long in the way we think of them. I think we should start there, Herman. Explain the math of a flexible hour.
Exactly. We are talking about proportional hours, or what is known in Hebrew as Shah Zamanit. If you look at ancient Israelite, Babylonian, or Roman systems, they did not just say the day has 24 hours and leave it at that. They divided the period of daylight from sunrise to sunset into 12 equal parts. Then they divided the period of darkness from sunset to sunrise into another 12 equal parts.
So, the length of an hour changed every single day.
Every single day. Think about where we are right now in Jerusalem. In the middle of the summer, the sun is up for about 14 hours and some change. If you divide those 14 hours of light by 12, each daylight hour is actually about 70 or 71 minutes long.
And then the night hours would have to be shorter to compensate?
You nailed it. The night hours in the summer would be much shorter, maybe only 49 or 50 minutes long. Then, in the winter, like right now in February, the whole thing flips. The sun rose today around 6:30 and will set around 5:30. That is only 11 hours of daylight. If you divide those 11 hours by 12, your workday hours are only about 55 minutes long.
That sounds incredibly confusing for anyone trying to keep a schedule. I mean, imagine trying to set a meeting for the third hour of the day. You have to do mental gymnastics based on the current date just to know when to show up. If I am a merchant meeting a supplier in the summer, the third hour is much later in the morning than it would be in the winter.
Well, that is the thing, Corn. They did not really do the math in their heads like that because they did not have a fixed, mean reference point to compare it to. To them, the third hour was not 9 o'clock. The third hour was simply the point when the sun was about a quarter of the way through its arc across the sky. It was visual. It was based on the environment. You did not look at a watch, you looked at the sky.
But how did they actually measure it with any precision? If I am a merchant and I tell you to meet me at the city gate at the 6th hour, how do we both know when that is without a watch? We can't both just squint at the sun and hope we agree on the angle.
Shadows were the primary tool. The simplest version was just a stick in the ground, which we call a gnomon. You could mark out segments on the ground where the shadow would fall. At the 6th hour, which is high noon, the shadow would be at its shortest point for that day. That was the most reliable anchor for the entire day. In fact, archaeologists have found ancient sundials throughout the Levant, like the famous one found at Qumran, that were specifically designed to track these proportional hours.
Wait, I have seen those. Some of them look like little limestone bowls with lines carved inside, right?
Exactly. Those are often called spherical sundials, or scaphe dials. Because the bowl is curved, it mimics the dome of the sky. The shadow of a small pointer, or style, moves across the lines carved into the bowl. Those lines were not straight. They were curved to account for the way the sun's path changes between the summer solstice and the winter solstice. It was a piece of analog hardware that automatically calculated the Shah's Zamanat for you.
That feels so much more grounded in the physical world than our current system. Today, I look at a digital screen and it tells me it is 2:45 in the afternoon. That number exists in a vacuum. It has nothing to do with where the sun is or what the weather is like. But for them, time was literally the relationship between the sun and the objects around them.
It really was. And Daniel's prompt touched on the night as well, which is where it gets even more interesting and, frankly, more difficult. You cannot use a sundial at night. In ancient Israel, the night was not just 12 hours, it was divided into watches or mishmarot.
Right, the night watches. I remember reading about this in historical texts. In the earlier biblical period, there were originally 3 watches of the night.
That is right. You had the first watch, which was roughly sunset to 10 in the evening, the middle watch from 10 to 2, and the morning watch from 2 until sunrise. Each one was about 4 of those proportional hours long. Later, under Roman influence during the Second Temple period, they moved to a 4-watch system to align with the Roman military shifts. But the purpose of these was deeply practical. It was about guard duty, temple service, and changing shifts for the people protecting the city walls.
So, if you were a guard on the city walls at 2 in the morning, how did you know your shift was over? You can't see a sundial. Were you just looking at the stars?
Stars were a big part of it. They used decans, or specific star groups that rose at different points during the night. But if it was cloudy, you needed a different kind of technology. The high-tech solution of the ancient world was the water clock, or clepsydra. It was basically a vessel with a small hole that let water drip out at a steady rate. You could mark the inside of the vessel to show the passing of time.
But wait, if the hours are proportional and change length every day, wouldn't a water clock be useless? Water drips at a constant rate regardless of the season.
You would think so, but the ancients were incredibly clever. Some water clocks had adjustable valves to change the drip rate. Others had different sets of markings for different months of the year. You would fill the jar to a certain level, and as the water drained, it would pass the winter marks or the summer marks. It was a manual calibration. You had to reset your clock's logic every few weeks to stay in sync with the sun.
This brings up a really interesting point about coordination. If time is this fluid, seasonal thing, how does a society function at scale? How do you coordinate a religious festival or a military maneuver across different cities?
You rely on natural signals and public proclamations. For example, in the Second Temple period here in Jerusalem, they used trumpets and shofars to signal the beginning and end of certain times. There was a specific spot on the southwest corner of the Temple Mount called the Place of Trumpeting. Archaeologists actually found a stone there with an inscription that says exactly that. A priest would stand there and blow the trumpet to let everyone in the city know that the Sabbath was beginning or that the morning sacrifice was about to happen.
So time was a shared auditory experience. You did not check your wrist. You listened for the signal from the highest point in the city.
Exactly. It was a communal pulse. And because everyone was living in the same environment, everyone was synced to the same natural cues. You did not need a synchronized network of servers because the sun was the server. If the trumpet blew, it was the official time, regardless of what your little home water clock said.
I wonder about the social pressure of punctuality back then. Daniel joked in his email about Daniel time versus Israeli time. In a world where an hour is 70 minutes long in the summer, was there even such a thing as being 5 minutes late?
Probably not in the way we think of it. If you said you would meet someone at the third hour, that was likely understood as a window of time rather than a precise moment. You would show up roughly when the sun was in that position. If you were a little early or a little late, it did not matter as much because the pace of life was dictated by the speed of a walking person or beast of burden. You couldn't speed up. You traveled to make up for those 5 minutes anyway.
It feels like there was a lot more grace in the system. But what about work? Daniel asked how people knew when to show up for work. If you were a laborer in a vineyard, how did the foreman decide when the day started?
It usually started at dawn, or what they called the first light. There is a famous parable in the New Testament about laborers in a vineyard where the owner goes out at the third, sixth, ninth, and 11th hours to hire more people. This shows us that the workday was strictly tied to those 12 daylight hours. You worked from sunup to sundown.
And if it was summer, you just worked longer days for the same daily wage?
You did. But the heat of the day, around the 6th hour noon, was often the time for a mandatory break. People would retreat into the shade because the sun was too intense for physical labor. So even though the hours were longer in the summer, the intensity of the work might be lower during that peak heat. It was a self-regulating system.
It is fascinating to think about how this influenced their literature and their legal systems. In the Talmud, which Daniel mentioned in his prompt, there are all these discussions about the latest time you can say the morning prayers. They have to define it very carefully because an hour is not a fixed unit. They say things like you can say the morning prayer until the third hour, which is when the sons of kings typically wake up.
I love that detail. It is a social benchmark used to define a chronological one. They are using human behavior as a clock. If the royal family is just getting out of bed, that marks a specific point in the morning. It is much more human-centric than saying 9 o'clock a.m. It ties time to the rhythm of the community.
It also makes me think about the transition to our current system. When did we decide that an hour should be 60 minutes, regardless of the sun? When did we kill the living hour?
That really started with the invention of the mechanical clock in Europe during the Middle Ages, around the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Once you have a machine with gears and weights, specifically the Virgin Foliote escapement, it wants to run at a constant speed. It does not care about the seasons, it just ticks. This led to the concept of equal hours, or mean time.
I imagine people hated that at first. It must have felt so unnatural to have the clock saying it was noon when the sun was still low in the sky in the winter, or when the sun had already passed its peak.
There was actually a lot of resistance. For a long time, towns would have two clocks, or they would keep their mechanical clocks and their sundials separate. In some places, they even tried to make mechanical clocks that could speed up or slow down to match the seasons, but it was too complex. Eventually, the efficiency of the machine won out. By the time the Industrial Revolution hit, we needed everyone to show up at the exact same mean minute to start the factory lines. The sun became irrelevant to the economy.
And now we are at the point where we are arguing about leap seconds. I was reading the other day that in 2022, the international community decided to scrap the leap second by 2035 because it causes too many problems for computer networks and high-frequency trading. We have completely detached ourselves from the rotation of the planet.
We have. We are now synced to the vibrations of cesium atoms. And while it allows for incredible technological feats, like the GPS that got you to this house today, I think we have lost that sense of being grounded that Daniel was hinting at. When you live by proportional hours, you are constantly aware of the tilt of the Earth and the cycle of the year. You are in sync with the cosmos in a way that a digital watch just cannot replicate.
It is a trade-off. We traded natural harmony for precision and global coordination, but I think there is something to be said for Daniel time. Maybe we should all be a little more comfortable with time being a bit more fluid. Let's talk more about the coordination aspect, though. You mentioned the Temple Mount and the trumpets. Was that common in other civilizations too, like in ancient Rome or Egypt?
Absolutely. In Rome, they had the excensus, a public official whose job was to shout out the time. The city was so big and noisy that you needed someone to literally walk around and announce the third hour or the sixth hour. They also had the forum, where the midday sun hitting a certain spot between the rostra and the grecostasis would be the signal for the end of the morning session of court.
It is almost like the entire city was a giant clock. The architecture itself was designed to mark the passage of time.
Exactly. In Egypt, they were the masters of this. The obelisks were not just monuments to the pharaohs, they were massive gnomons for sundials. They could tell the time of day and even the time of year by the length and direction of the shadow cast by those giant stone needles. If you were an ancient Egyptian, you could look at the horizon and see these massive stone clocks telling everyone the same story. It was a very public, very visible form of timekeeping.
So, if you were an ancient Egyptian, you could look at the horizon and see these massive stone clocks telling everyone the same story. It was a very public, very visible form of timekeeping. But it also seems very top-down.
It was. And it was also very hierarchical. The priests and the elite were the ones who truly understood the calendars and the complex mathematics behind the celestial movements. For the average farmer, time was just the flooding of the Nile and the rising of the sun. The secret knowledge of time was a form of power.
That brings up the question of the calendar. We've been talking about hours, but what about days and months? How did they coordinate over longer periods? If I wanted to meet you for a festival in 3 months, how did we ensure we were on the same page?
In this part of the world, it was all about the moon. The lunar cycle is about 29.5 days, which is a very easy thing for anyone to track. You see the new crescent and you know the month has started. It is the most democratic clock in existence because everyone can see the moon.
But a lunar year 12 lunar months is only about 354 days. A solar year is 365 and a quarter. If you just follow the moon, your seasons will start drifting. Your spring festival will eventually happen in the middle of winter.
Right, and that is why the ancient Israelites and the Babylonians used a lunisolar calendar. They would add an extra month, an intercalary month, every few years to keep the lunar months aligned with the solar seasons. In ancient Israel, during the Second Temple period, this was done by observation and judicial decision.
Wait, so they did not have a pre-calculated calendar? They just decided on the fly?
Essentially, yes. The Sanhedrin, the high court here in Jerusalem, would wait for witnesses to come and testify that they had seen the new moon. Once the moon was sighted and the witnesses were vetted, the court would declare Makudash, it is sanctified. Then they would light signal fires on the mountaintops to spread the word across the land.
That is incredible. It is like an ancient version of a fiber optic network. You see a fire on a hill, you light your own fire, and within hours, everyone from here to Babylon knows the new month has begun.
It was a very effective system, but it was also prone to interference. There are records in the Mishnah of rival groups, like the Samaritans, lighting fake fires on different nights to confuse the Jewish communities in the diaspora about the date of a festival. It shows you that even back then, controlling time was a form of psychological and political power. If you can trick your neighbor into celebrating a holiday on the wrong day, you've broken their connection to the community.
Time as a social construct, indeed. If you can control when the month starts, you control when the taxes are due and when the holidays happen. Eventually, though, they moved away from the fires, right?
They did. They switched to messengers, which was slower but more secure. And eventually, around the year 358 of the Common Era, Hillel II established a fixed, calculated calendar based on the Metonic cycle. That is the system still used for the Hebrew calendar today. We are currently in the year 5786, and because of Hillel's math, we know exactly when the holidays will fall for the next 10,000 years without needing to look for a fire on a hill.
It is funny how we have come full circle. We started with the sun and the moon, moved to mechanical gears, then to quartz crystals, and now we rely on the vibrations of atoms. But at the end of the day, we are still just trying to figure out when to meet for coffee.
Or when to start the podcast.
True. And speaking of that, I think we have given Daniel a lot to chew on. The idea of the Shah Zamanet and the proportional hour is such a fundamental shift in how we think about a day. It makes our modern obsession with minutes and seconds seem almost arbitrary. It makes me wonder if our stress levels would go down if we went back to sun time.
I think they would. There is a psychological weight to a ticking clock that says you are late for a meeting at 9:05. But if the third hour is a 70-minute window, you have time to breathe. You have time to notice the shadow of the olive tree moving across the stones.
I love that. Before we wrap up, Herman, do you have any practical takeaways for our listeners? If they wanted to try living on ancient time for a day, how would they do it?
I would say, try a shadow day. Leave your phone in a drawer and try to navigate your day using only the sun. If you have a yard or a balcony, put a stick in the ground in the morning. Mark where the shadow is when you start your day. See if you can identify the 6th hour just by finding the point where that shadow is shortest. It is a great exercise in awareness. You will find yourself noticing the environment in a way you never have before. You will notice the clouds, the angle of the light, and the way the birds change their behavior as the watches of the day progress.
I might try that this weekend, though I suspect I will be very late for our next recording session.
Just tell me you are on Herman Poppleberry time. It is very flexible. It stretches and contracts based on how interesting the conversation is.
I will use that excuse. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the evolution of timekeeping. A huge thanks to Daniel for the prompt. It is always a pleasure to explore these topics with you, Herman, especially here in a city where you can still see the ancient sundials carved into the walls if you know where to look.
Likewise, Corn. It is amazing how much history is hidden in the way we count the hours. We think we are so advanced with our atomic clocks, but the ancients were just as precise in their own way. They just chose to be precise about their relationship with the earth rather than their relationship with a machine.
And to our listeners, if you are enjoying these deep dives into the weird and wonderful prompts we get, please consider leaving us a review on your favorite podcast app, whether it is Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Those ratings really help new people find the show. We're coming up on some big milestones this year, and your support means the world to us.
They really do. We appreciate all the feedback and the community that has grown around the show over these 700 plus episodes. It is your curiosity that keeps us digging into these rabbit holes.
You can find all of our past episodes and a way to get in touch with us at myweirdprompts.com. We also have an RSS feed there if you want to subscribe directly and avoid the algorithms. And if you have a topic you want us to explore, whether it is ancient technology, weird history, or something completely off the wall, you can reach us at show@myweirdprompts.com.
We look forward to hearing from you. Until next time, keep your shadows long and your curiosity even longer.
Thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. We will see you in the next one. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.